I wanted to write about a very powerful and strong friendship between people who are quite different and have led very different lives than each other.
Alice Elliott Dark is here to discuss her new novel, Fellowship Point, about the lifelong friendship between two women.
I think the central image that keeps us fascinated with Joan of Arc all these years later is the mental image of a woman in armor on horseback going to war.
Catherine Chen joins me to discuss Joan, her new novel imagining the life of Joan of Arc. Plus, Liz Harris will have news from the publishing world, and my colleagues MJ Franklin and Liz Egan join me to talk about what we've been reading. This is the Book Review Podcast. It's July 8th. I'm John Williams. Alice Elliott Dark joins me now. She's the author of the novel Think of England, which followed two remarkable story collections, Naked to the Waist and In the Gloaming. Her second novel, just published, is Fellowship Point, and we're lucky to have her here to talk about it. Hi, Alice. Great to meet you.
Good morning, John. I'm so happy to be here.
So this is a very big book, so let's take it in little, both literally and metaphorically. There's a lot going on in it. Give me the sort of initial setup of the book, maybe the two primary characters and what their situation is.
Okay, well, the story opens on a winter day in the year 2000, and we see Agnes Lee, who's 80 years old, in her apartment in Philadelphia, where she lives part of the year. She lives most of the year in Maine. And she has a bad case of writer's block, which she's never had before in her life. But she's still doing her 5 hours, as she does every day. She's worrying, though, about a couple of things that have come up. She has a recurrence of cancer, which she kind of brushes off because that's the kind of person she is. But she's also just read an article from the local paper in Maine where she found out a developer has his eyes on Fellowship Point for a hotel marina, which horrifies her. And her best friend, Polly, they've been friends since babies, who also has a house on Fellowship Point, comes by after an afternoon of the orchestra, and Agnes says, okay, we have to settle the legacy of Fellowship Point now before it's too late. Before we die, before it's out of our hands. And Agnes's idea is to give it to a land trust. The two other people who have shares are Polly and Agnes's nephew. And she thinks it's going to be a breeze to do this. And as it turns out, they have their own agendas and their own considerations, and it's off to the races from there.
It is very much a novel with complicated human characters at its core, and that's the experience of reading it. But I wonder about that idea of conservation and whether that was the initial spark or the larger theme or idea that drew you to the story.
It really wasn't the initial spark. I came in actually through a character who turns out to be not a big character on the page, named Virgil. But the issue of land ownership, land conservation has always been of deep interest to me. And I came to that pretty quickly as I was developing the story. I decided I wanted to write something like a 19th century style novel. And I wanted to have it be modern. So I thought women didn't own land in the 19th century. They didn't make decisions about land, even if they did own it. And having women landowners dealing with these issues seemed to me a modern version of a big, older 19th century type novel.
And in addition to that aspect of the book, you also have Agnes and Polly, obviously advanced in life, looking back at a lot of their relationship. There are other things that they're wrestling with in terms of their personal legacies and their relationships. So I'll try again, and not to be reductive, but is the major spark or the tentpole of the book the relationship between Agnes and Polly and the ways that people who have known each other for so long interact?
It really turned out to be that way, yes. I would say I wanted to write about a very powerful and strong friendship between people who are quite different and have led very different lives than each other. And I specifically wanted to write about a friendship between women, because often friendships between women are portrayed as antagonistic. And this is an 80-year friendship between people who have been through everything together. And yes, that turned out to be the central concern of the book, really.
There's a great subplot that's introduced fairly early on in which a 20-something editorial assistant at a publishing company gets in touch with Agnes. She's a big fan of Agnes's children's books. She writes both those and under a pseudonym these books about Philadelphia society. And the editorial assistant is a big fan and wants to try to get her to write a memoir. How did you inhabit Agnes's thoughts about that? And what is her initial feeling about whether or not that's worth doing?
Her initial response was just about the same as her response to finding out that someone wanted to build a hotel marina on her land. She was pretty horrified. She's very private. She's kept some big secrets, which come out in the book eventually, of course. She's kept some big secrets all her life. And the idea that some young 26-year-old comes along and says, share your secrets, just spill them. She's negative on that for quite a while. And then she writes a version of the book which the young woman rejects. Her name is Maud, which Maud rejects as being, yeah, this is pretty, but no one likes pretty that much. So go back to the drawing board, which Agnes can't believe. She's never had that kind of response before.
So this 26-year-old not only has the temerity to ask her to write a memoir, but then to reject it.
Exactly.
I have to ask a couple of process-ish questions. You mentioned Agnes's 5 hours. I wonder if that's part of your own plan. And also, the book bounces back and forth between characters' perspectives. And how do you as an author work that out? It's also a long book. Are you someone who outlines or has a chart? Or how do you decide when you're going to switch voices and what you're working on at any given time?
I love both of those questions. I wish 5 hours were my process. It isn't. I have a job, professor at Rutgers, Newark, and the job takes up a lot of time. On a good day, if I have nothing else to do, I will try to take the whole day. And out of the whole day, I probably get 3 hours of real work done, but I'm extremely distractible. So Agnes was my role model. I just wrote for her what I wished. And in terms of switching back and forth between the characters, that was a little tricky. Sometimes I wrote a whole character storyline, and then I went back and cut in another character. Sometimes I did outline, but I didn't outline anything until probably after the second or third draft of the book. Then I stepped back. I was at McDowell, but at that point it was 1,400 pages, and I just lay them all over the room and tried to figure out how they went together, because they really were just writing into the void, trying to see what was going on. And after that, I did an outline.
I called it a long book. I didn't realize that it could have been so much longer.
Oh,
so,
yes.
At say 550, 600 pages, you really whittled it down, Alice. So so you're sitting there with 1,400 pages. Is that a very painful process to whittle it down, or are you someone who's fairly ruthless and once you start to see something that could be trimmed, you kind of go at it?
I'm pretty ruthless because I write easily. So I can write a couple of 100 pages, and if it has to go, it has to go. And I'm fine with that. I really do have a sense of wanting everything to be balanced, wanting it to be like a beautiful painting, to have the colors, to have everything all in proportion. So if someone tells me, for example, my editor, Mary Subrucci, was really wonderful. If she tells me, think about this, I had 4 male point of view in the book too, which they're all gone. And she said, think about whether that would be a good way to make the book shorter. And I thought, you know what? That would be a good way to make the book shorter. So it wasn't painful for me.
That's interesting that the big picture is, that balance being more important sort of allows you to not care as much, maybe to get so wedded to some of the smaller pieces that you might have to jettison along the way. When you say you write easily, that's also fascinating, because I'm sure a lot of people will grit their teeth hearing that and now wish that they were you the way you wish you were Agnes. And when you say that, do you mean that you write something usable very easily, and that then the majority of the work for you is in that kind of culling and switching around?
I wouldn't say I write something usable very easily, but I don't cross out every single sentence anymore, which I did do for years. I'm not a perfectionist anymore. I just let things flow onto the page and I enjoy it. It's my favorite part of the day. I just enjoy it. And that's hard won, though. For those who hate hearing it, it's a hard won place that I'm in now with my writing. And it took a lot of thinking and working to just decide, okay, I'm just going to be on my own side about this and worry about everything else later. So yes, it does make it less painful to cut something because I know I can go write something else the next day.
I wonder also if some of that is writing a novel versus writing a short story, because I imagine that in writing a short story, you can at least have the illusion that you might get it perfect, whereas a novel is so big that you have to give up some control in order to get it done. Does that sound right?
That is so, so true. Yes. I love short stories and I do find them to be very exacting. I think they're like poems. Every word counts. Everything that's in the story counts. It all adds up in a very particular way. And I labor more when I write a story. Turning over to writing a big novel like this, I did feel in many novels that I've read, there's like in Moby Dick, for example, there's just all kinds of stuff that's just thrown in that could be removed just for the pure storyline. So I took the liberty of doing that myself. I just went down a lot of tangents. They're not in the book anymore. But it was very pleasurable to do that.
So going back to the plot for a moment, as the novel progresses and the conservation becomes such a key event, is any of that connected to your own experience? Do you have experience with environmental causes? Did you do research for it? And did you learn anything about the way these things are done and what we might do to protect these places?
Yes, I did a lot of research. I am familiar with a lot of these issues just from going to Maine every summer and being around it, but not just Maine, it's sort of everywhere. And I did learn a lot more than I knew before. I wanted to portray a very particular, rather 20th century idea of land conservation coming into the 21st century and a bit of changes that occur. A lot of the land trusts have become very powerful. And in the past, it was very much like Agnes and Polly and their ancestors who had the idea, basically from reading Walden, that they should conserve this land.
I read that you actually wrote an entire other novel in the early 21st century that you shelved in favor of this one. Did you start this one back then, or was there a longer process in getting to this idea?
There were two attempts that sit in plastic bins in my basement that just were novels I couldn't figure out. And I started this one in 2011 and I had hit a wall really. And I just said, okay, I don't know what I'm doing. And I was at a residency and I was sitting in a chair for many hours doing nothing. And then Virgil, the character who's Virgil, came in and I just followed him for a while, probably a few months I wrote about him. And then it developed from there.
So somewhere you also have in a bin maybe a few hundred pages of a novel about Virgil?
It could have been, but he turned out to be too limited as being the subject of a novel.
Poor Virgil, useful, but limited.
I know. I have all his pages. I'm not throwing him out, but he just doesn't get to be in the book.
Well, he birthed this novel, so that's to his credit.
He's in there a little bit. He's in there enough.
I know that I don't want to ask specifically because I know this can be a source of agitation, but are you working on something new?
I am. I'm working on a book that's actually a sequel to my story in the Gloaming, which is a story that was in the New Yorker in the 90s. And I've just kept writing about the characters for all these years.
Wow.
And I just couldn't let go of them at the end of the story. At the time I wrote it, people said, why don't you turn it into a novel? But that would have all had to be backstory. But now, this many years later, all those characters have gone on and lived lives, and they've lived lives impacted by that death. So I do have a book about that now. And I also wanted to write more about the character of Laird, who's the central character in that book, who dies of AIDS when he's 33 years old. And I wanted to write about him in the late 70s when New York was a wonderful place to be for a man who was beautiful and social and outgoing, and everything changed very quickly after that. But I wanted to show him at his peak of beauty and glory.
Wow. Well, I'm glad I asked. That's very exciting. You called it a short story in the New Yorker, which of course is impressive enough, but it was also chosen understandably by John Updike as one of the best American short stories of the century. So if people have not read In the Gloaming, they should do so immediately. The new novel, again, by Alice Elliott Dark, is Fellowship Point. In the New York Times Book Review, Kate Christensen calls it a novel rich with social and psychological insights, both earnest and sly, big ideas grounded in individual emotions, a portrait of a tightly knit community made up of artfully drawn individual souls. Alice, thanks again for being here to talk about it.
Thank you so much, John. I really enjoyed it.
Catherine Chen's second novel, Joan, tells the story of Joan of Arc, whose life continues to fascinate and inspire us nearly 600 years after she died. Catherine, thanks for being here to talk about it.
Hi, John. Thank you for having me on the show.
So I suppose the question you're already sick of answering, we'll get it out of the way first, is that many have told Joan's story. I want to know why you wanted to, and I guess part of that is just what your thought or vision of her was that you wanted to get across.
Well, it's interesting. I was all set to write a novel about another larger-than-life religious figure. And the very next day or very soon after, I began looking over my bookshelves, and I came across a biography of Joan of Arc that I'd totally forgotten that I purchased years and years ago. It must have been at least 2 or possibly even 3 years. I hadn't read it. I hadn't even opened to the first page, and I bought it for the most superficial and one might say magpie of reasons, which is that I liked the cover. It was the shiny gold foil cover. And I knew Joan of Arc by name and reputation only. And I remember, making this promise to myself where I said, as I began looking into her life, I would try to write about her if the impulse came to me, but it's such a tall order and there's such a plethora of material that it can work both ways. So I didn't hold myself to it.
I have to ask very briefly, what was the other religious figure you were going to write about?
Oh, I was going to write about Christ.
Okay, well, you have a long career ahead of you, so we'll save that for maybe a future
Yes,
podcast.
It was going to be a book about Christ's youth because I was so inspired by the Testament of Mary by Colm Tóibín.
I love that book too. So back to Joan. So you presumably you read this biography and then much more, and so something started to coalesce in you.
Yes, I felt this sea change occur in me, and I wanted to understand and make tangible her story. I think the central image that keeps us fascinated with Joan of Arc all these years later is the mental image of a woman in armor on horseback going to war. I think that image keeps us enthralled to this day because it's as startling and surprising as it is empowering. And the other thing is, I think we are to this day fascinated with the sheer improbability as well as, almost impossibility of such a story having ever taken place. Yet it did. And, it sounds almost apocryphal, like something out of a fable or fairy tale. The story of a young woman who leaves her home, leaves everything she knows behind, and finds herself in the company of the highest echelon of nobility in her kingdom, and then finds herself propelled to the head of the army in the middle of a conflict that has already lasted for 85 years or, several decades.
You offer that image, and I think it's accurate, of her in armor on horseback going into war. And I sense from some of the notes in the book and your own writing about it that even though that's the image that comes into our head, it almost seems like you wanted to recenter that idea of her as a warrior as opposed to more of a mystic or a visionary. Talk about that balance between her, what has been seen, at least historically, as her religious visionary side, and how you maybe underplayed that in the book intentionally.
Well, I'm interested in how a hero is made. It brings to mind that quote, and I hope I'm not misquoting, from Maya Angelou. I think it was an interview that she had with the Paris Review. It's quite a popular quote where she says, I believe that a diamond is the result of extreme pressure and time. Less time is crystal, less than that is coal, less than that is fossilized leaves, less than that is just plain dirt. And I wanted to think of Joan as a product of the times in which she lived, of her obviously, youthful trauma, of various experiences in her life. And I think it's one of the great paradoxes of a warrior's history that their fame and the means by which they achieve military glory must be at so deadly and terrible a cost. And, the thing with Joan as a visionary, or, the more mystical qualities, is she was not exceptional in this. There are other saints around the same time who experienced visions, such as Richard of Sweden, Catherine of Siena. There was another French prophet but right before Joan, Mary Robin, who actually had a vision of armor and of weapons. And when she had this vision, she was afraid that the vision meant that she would have to put this armor on. And apparently, the vision informed her that it's not for you. And I think that vision is meant to suggest Joan's impending arrival. So I believe that Joan was not unique in the fact that she supposedly had visions and revelations. I think she's unique in that she actually did more than what the prophet does, which is that obviously she threw herself into action. And I think there is this fascination too with the fact of her death and the fact that she was so young when she died.
Right. And yet your novel stopped short of that point. Why did you make that decision?
Well, there are two parts to this. I think it would have been extremely hard to translate the trials and the numerous sessions involved in her court case into fiction because they are very repetitive. I did read the trial transcripts, and she basically repeats herself a lot. She equivocates a lot. She will say to those who are questioning her, I don't want to answer that question, pass on to the next question, or she will say, I already answered that question. And there was so much time and emphasis on the fact that she wouldn't swear the oath. And she would say, oh, I've already sworn. And she might equivocate and say, well, I will tell you things pertaining to the trial. I will gladly tell you things pertaining to my father and mother, but I will not reveal other things. And you must apply to the king of France for that information. And that just consumed so much time. And I couldn't imagine transferring that successfully into fiction. And of course, the whole trial lasted a long period as well. I think it was also an attempt on my part to show some mercy to both myself and the reader, possibly, to spare both me and the reader of the horrific event of her death, which was by no means short. It was obviously very painful and prolonged. I believe that I came across this when I was reading that the pyre was built possibly too high, and so the fire could not be built very strong, and so she died very slowly. I think I also wanted to avoid any romantic notions of her death, which I strongly reject. I don't like to believe apocryphal stories such as a dove appearing conveniently as she was burning or as her soul expired, or the Englishman who says, oh, we have just killed a saint, because she was not canonized until nearly 500 years after her death.
It's interesting, the several parallels actually to Christ that I've noticed in the last couple of answers. So it will be interesting if you ever do turn to his life for fiction. So tell us about the start of this book. She's 10 in the first scene. It's quite a remarkable opening scene. Why did you decide to start it there, and what happens in that scene?
Well, 1422 was a significant year for a few reasons. Historically, it is the year that two kings died in relatively quick succession. The first being Henry V of Shakespearean fame. He died in late August 1422, and Charles VI, King of France, died a little less than 2 months later in late October. So I thought those two were significant enough events that I should start in that year. And it's also somewhat ideally positioned with respect to other historic events, such as Battle of Agincourt being in 1415, so a mere 7 years in the past. The Treaty of Troyes was signed in 1420, in, I believe, the month of May. 1422 was also the year that the Dauphin, Charles VII, who's a major player in the book, married Marie of Anjou. And I guess the second reason is that I wanted to start at an age where I believe Joan's character and personality are not fully formed. There are glimmers of what she will become, but she's still in the process of developing as a person. She's curious about what is around her. She's aware of the world around her. She's been living kind of on the edge of her seat for all of her life because she's living in wartime. And also, I think 10 years old is an age where she's more or less settled into the pattern of her life. She knows what to expect from her father, which is trauma, basically, and brutality. She knows what to expect from her sister, Catherine, which is kindness.
And remarkably and sadly, she's at midlife at that point.
Yes.
So in this scene, she and some children from her village are essentially having a battle of sorts with rocks and then with fists with children from another village. And we don't have to give away what happens in the scene, but is this a moment when you think Joan, is this a catalytic moment for Joan, or are there others in the book where her focus or her motivation starts to become clear?
Oh, yes, absolutely. And I should mention that that is historically true. Not so much what precisely happens in the scene, which we won't give away, but Joan does say in her trial that she witnessed boys returning to her village bloodied and bruised from waging these miniature battles with the neighboring Burgundian town. So that is where that inspiration came from. And it's also something of a through line, I believe, in the whole book. The movement from a battle in miniature to the actual battles. And of course, later, which is also a true event, she cradles the head of an English soldier in her lap, and she basically holds him as he dies. And that is also true to history.
So you finish this biography, you read a bunch more. How much research did you do, and how did you decide when to stop? Because there's so much that you could read and research about this, not just Joan's life, but of course the period in history as a whole.
Yes, I've read many biographies, and also I wanted to extend my reading to books about daily medieval life. Also, of course, the 100 Years' War, which was already in swing well before Joan's arrival. It began in 1337, I think. And I believe the thing with research is that it can give you a lot of raw material to shape and play with like clay, but it can also be extremely limiting at times too. I'm personally a firm believer, if I may say, that historical fiction should always try to aspire to more than merely retelling or a strict rehashing of biography or historical record. Otherwise, I don't personally see the point, and I don't see what justifies the entrance of the novelist if there are already a great number of very readable biographies and texts on someone like Joan, who is already larger than life. So I think the novelist has to do something with a twist or from a slightly new angle.
Well, I think that makes sense because the phrase is historical fiction. So the second part should be emphasized as much as the first. And in your case, what did that entail? So without going item by item, when you say that, you felt free to take some liberties, was there anywhere in particular or a place or two where you felt like you did that the most, or where it just felt the most necessary narratively?
What I did was I created 3 very extensive timelines, and this was nothing fancy. It was just in a Word document, and the document is very, very huge. I created a timeline of Joan of Arc's life, key events in the 100 Years' War, and timelines of key players in the 100 Years' War. And I would look for gaps and also for threads, such as, like we mentioned, the rock throwing battle, which is accurate to history. Obviously, I don't know that specific sequence of events happened, but there were such battles. And also the Burgundian individual who nearly dies from the attack, that was also true to history. There was a Burgundian ally or someone who sympathized with the Burgundians who was killed because he was, I guess, unfairly blamed for stealing livestock. So it was mostly taking these threads, and I would say that the majority of them came from the margins of my research rather from the center. If you read any work on Joan of Arc, the revelations and the visions take up so much space that they basically overpower the narrative. And I didn't want that for this work because I think that essentially removes her sense of agency and choice and any human dilemma that enters into her life. Basically, it's saying, I went to battle because an angel told me to. I pulled an arrow out of the flesh between my neck and shoulder and returned to battle bloodied because an angel told me to. I assured my soldiers that they would win in battle because I was already ensured my victory by the angels. And that's just a totally different narrative than the one I'm going for.
All of those episodes of visions, what is the source of those in the historical record? Is that all from Joan's own recounting?
Much of it comes from the trial that condemned her to die. And it's interesting that you bring that up because supposedly on May 30th, which was the day of her death in 1431, and I read this from Daniel Hobbin's excellent work, which is titled The Trial of Joan of Arc. Supposedly on the day that she died, she said that the visions had failed her. She realized that she wasn't going to be rescued. She realized that she wasn't going to be ransomed and that she would face probably the most brutal of deaths. And so it was a rather pessimistic attitude, supposedly, in the end. There's an obvious bias to this because the account comes from obviously a very hostile enemy. So I think that is good to keep in mind.
You write about Joan becoming very alive to you throughout this project, and you even dedicate the book to her. And I know that in publishing the day when the book comes out, which is just now, so congratulations on that, is a bit of a ways after you've closed the writing of it and the editing of it. Has that feeling faded at all since you wrapped up the book, or is she still as vivid to you now?
I think she is probably a little less vivid, but I do feel, and it might be strange and a little uncanny to say, that I do feel her presence. And she was with me when I was ill in 2019. I received medical treatment for a number of months on and off. I wasn't always in the doctor's office or in the hospital, but I was ill for that period of time from early 2019 to about mid 2019. And it was interesting because I had already written a version of the book before that year. And that version of the book was 200,000 words. And it was very adherent to Joan's history. The saints were very much present in that work. And the role that they served was rather like comic relief. They would appear like genies without the puff of smoke. They would disappear. And they would banter with Joan, and she would poke fun of them, and they would joke with her. And there was even this weird scene where they would tell her about this cherub in heaven who marked their record book with demerits because they arrived late. They returned to heaven late, and so their record was blotted. And so it was rather a silly work, and I'm glad that I scrapped it and threw it out the window. But basically what happened was after my treatment ended in mid-2019, I rewrote the book from scratch. And that was when I really began to feel Joan's company, also because I needed it. I live quite an isolated life, and she was my friend and companion throughout the rewriting.
Remarkable that after all this time, she still has such a hold on all of our imaginations and very much comes alive in your own vision of her in this book. The novel, again, is Joan, and the author is Chen. Catherine, thanks for being here.
Thank you, John, for having me on the show. This was fun.
My colleague Liz Harris joins me now with news from the literary world. Hi, Liz.
Hi, John.
You and our colleague Alexandra Alter have been reporting in recent months on the large increase in efforts to ban certain books in parts of the United States. And you recently wrote a long piece together about one particular angle on that and some unlikely people who are on the front lines of this war.
Yeah, those people are librarians. A parent might go up to a librarian and have a one-on-one conversation, say they're concerned about a book. If they were really worried about something, felt it really wasn't appropriate, they could fill out a form and a committee would review it and decide whether the book should stay on the shelves. And it was a quiet process. But as this whole issue has become really heightened, there are bills being introduced in several states that would make it easier to remove books that are challenged. Politicians are running campaign ads about this. The Proud Boys, which is an extremist group, has shown up at school board meetings where books are on the agenda and like LGBTQ story hours, things like that. So as that has become more intense, the pressure on librarians has become more intense as well. And it's gone from being these individual conversations to librarians are being called pedophiles on social media and in public meetings. They're being called out by politicians and even reported to law enforcement sometimes. So they've gone from being respected members of their community to seen by many, including many of their neighbors, as villains.
Are these mostly school libraries? It's a mix of school libraries and public libraries?
It is actually both. So a lot of this current wave started in school libraries. People get more heightened about things when it involves their children or children in general. But now it has also spread to public libraries, which some people consider to be an escalation in a sense, because it goes from being children at this school should be able to access this book to no one should be able to access this book in a library. But public libraries, as well as school libraries, have had these sort of quiet challenges forever as well. But yeah, it's both kinds at this point.
Is it fair to say that most librarians feel like it's their job to err on the side of allowing more things to be on the shelves than less?
Librarians are trained to put together collections that reflect a variety of viewpoints, especially when it comes to contentious topics. And they're not trying to reflect just the community in which the library is based. They're trying to reflect the whole wider world. So it's sort of a matter of professional ethics for them to not be removing books just because one group doesn't like them. And I spoke to a number of people who consider this to be very painful. They're being asked to do things that they consider unethical and wrong and also harmful to their communities. I mean, a lot of books that have been targeted have LGBTQ characters in them or LGBTQ themes. And by taking the books off the shelves, what message are you sending to, for example, a young gay kid who's sort of a book about me is bad. So what does that say about me? And so there's concern about the larger ethical issues and then the individual kids in these individual communities that are going to be harmed.
And in addition to the professional discomfort, obviously being harassed publicly and on social media, what kind of effect is this having on people? Is there an attrition in the job at this point?
It's hard to know exactly what the numbers are, but there are definitely people who are quitting. I spoke to a number of people who either left the profession or left where they were living, left their communities and moved across the country. I spoke to one woman who was in Arkansas and quit her job and was looking for another one and ended up in Vermont, but saw a job posting in Montana and did a little research and found out there were similar issues happening in that community, and she decided not to apply for it. People are making hard decisions to leave their community or leave their jobs because they feel personally attacked or that they're being asked to do things that they don't agree with.
And presumably some of them are digging in their heels and fighting harder.
Yes, that is true. I mean, also, some people can't move, and you can't quit your job. You need your job. So this is a really difficult position. And some people are just doing what they can. You can't necessarily just quit.
And you had mentioned Arkansas and Montana. I've been assuming that these are fairly conservative communities where these fights happen, but it sounds like it's pretty widespread and nationwide, more or less.
Yeah, it's happening all over. We spoke to people in New Jersey. We spoke to people in Illinois. It's not just conservative communities.
Well, you mentioned speaking to people in all those places, so I urge people to go online and read the full article because there are several voices in there from your and Alexandra's reporting that really flesh out the story and give it that human face, and it's both fascinating and troubling. Thanks for being here to talk about it, Liz.
Thanks, John.
My colleagues MJ Franklin and Liz Egan join me now to talk about what we've been reading lately. Hello.
Hello, hello.
Hi, John. Hi, MJ.
MJ, I feel like it's been a little bit since you've been on the show. What have you been up to?
Well, first, thank you for having me back. And what I've been up to is reading. And specifically, I am currently reading Everything I Need I Get From You, How Fangirls Created the Internet as We Know It by Caitlin Tiffany. This is a small, smart, hysterically funny book about internet culture. It's is from Caitlin Tiffany, is a staff writer at The Atlantic. And this book looks at fangirls, this entity, this cultural force that we tend to think of as young, out of control girls who are so obsessed with some pop culture figure that they're in love and can't contain themselves.
Losing
on the
sleep
internet.
over it.
Losing sleep, screaming, stalking people. There's this really dominant image of the quote unquote fangirl. And what this book does is say, actually, what you think of when you think about fangirls is wrong. And actually, they created the infrastructure of our modern day internet. And so what I mean is, the book is anchored to the One Direction fandom, which Caitlin says is pretty critical to the internet because the One Direction fandom came to be as social media was going from something that you used to something that was everywhere. And they're not just like obsessive fans who are in love with One Direction, but actually they are a self-contained internet community. And the way that they connect with each other, the way that they talk to each other, the way they riff off of this cultural force, in this case, One Direction, I think Caitlin says, is like this perfectly bland cipher. You can map anything onto them because they're like charming and fun and very present and very online. And there's a lot of video of them. And there are 5 of them, so you can mix and match your favorites. That these two cultural forces, the rise of social media and the rise of One Direction, happened at a critical juncture at the same time. And that language from like words like standing to how celebrities understand internet culture and how they engage with fans, like that fangirls created that infrastructure for the internet that we use today.
Does she embed with some of these people, or is it mostly her observing this from her own travels on social media and on the web?
I'd say it's a mix of both. What I love about this is that it is personal, smart, authoritative, and funny. So I say personal in that Caitlin was a huge member of the One Direction fandom herself. So this is coming from personal experience. She is talking about all of these memes where she's like, I was there. I remember this. I remember when Harry Styles puked on the side of a road and then a fan set up a sign that said Harry Styles puked here. And then years later, I went to go visit the sign. Like, she is there. But then what she does is she says, what you can understand the internet based off of how people weren't actually like going to go see Harry's vomit, and they weren't collecting Harry's vomit. And she didn't go there because she wanted to feel closer to Harry. She went there because it was like a funny joke that she really remembered and that she wanted to be a part of. And she wanted to turn this thing that she saw online into her own memory. It was part of her own journey. And therefore, this weird fandom moment is actually saying something about how we form memories, we form our own identity, how internet culture really shapes our own lives.
How internet community leads out into the real world all over the place now. And is it all pegged to this One Direction fandom, or does she go into other cliques?
She goes to other cliques. The first chapter is actually about the idea of the screaming fan. And each of the chapters is titled with something like screaming, like the word trash. No, what is it? Trending. And so each chapter is titled after this like phenomenon, and then it goes into it. So the first chapter is called Screaming. And instead of talking about One Direction fans screaming, it goes back to another fandom, Beatlemania.
That's exactly what I pictured when you mentioned the screaming fans. To me, that's the icon. That's the original meme.
Yeah, and she says something really so smart about that I never thought of, which is just we always picture the screaming fan and we say they're out of control, but we never ask, why are they screaming? And for Beatlemania, which was coming up in the 60s as this backdrop of like social change and societal change, and like coming out of like pretty regressive like politics around women in the 50s, for instance, and as women's rights continued to expand over the century, Beatlemania provided an outlet to scream, to lose control in a society where you were tasked with being buttoned up. And so it wasn't just that like these fans were so in love with the Beatles, is that like they needed this existential release, and Beatlemania provided that. So they talk about Beatlemania, they talk about Bruce Springsteen fans, they talk about fandoms on Tumblr like Supernatural. It's so comprehensive. And it does this thing that I kind of love in general, which is it pairs this high-low. It's like it talks so smartly and in such a pretty like informed high way about internet culture in all of these like sociological, philosophical, psychological studies. And there's a lot of science and there's a lot of research here. But at the end of the day, it's also anchored to like the One Direction fandom. And the things that the fandom was doing is so hilarious. Like they talk about how they decided that the weird wax figure of Liam was going to be a thing. And so it's like wax Liam is like a cultural, like a touchstone in this fandom. Or they talk about how they pretended that Niall was in a relationship with a leaf because there are pictures of him like next to leaves while all of the other boys were in relationships. And quote unquote Neef was a thing because that was their ship name. Like I have laughed out loud so much while reading this book and while learning stuff about the internet.
Well, you made me laugh by picturing a promo for One Direction that would be One Direction, mix and match your favorites. And that, I appreciate that. Liz, what are you reading? And are you fangirl screaming over it?
I am fangirl screaming so far over a book that I just picked up last night called Thank You for Listening by Julia Whalen. I'm cheating a little bit. I apologize to listeners. This book actually isn't out until August 2nd, but you don't have to wait long. And Julia Whalen's name might be familiar to you, not only because she's the author of another novel called My Oxford Year, but because she is one of the world's preeminent audiobook narrators. And this novel, Thank You for Listening, very cleverly titled, is the story of an audiobook narrator who has been strategically avoiding recording romance novels. And it's kind of about how she gets sucked back into the romance world and at the same time has a one-night encounter with a very handsome stranger at a book convention in Las Vegas. The main character's name is Swanee Chester, and she had been an aspiring actor, but had a terrible accident that caused her to lose her eye. And so she pivots into this other unexpected career. As an audiobook enthusiast, it's a really fun window into really what recording an audiobook entails. And it's also so far very funny and sarcastic. It has lots of clever dialogue. And as I'm reading it, I'm hearing it in Julia Whalen's voice.
Yeah, wait. Why aren't you listening to this one? As an audiobook enthusiast, this seems like the perfect...
know. I should, but I have the actual book, which, as
right,
you all
the other
know,
one isn't out yet.
Yeah, is a treat to have the real book. But Julia is the voice of, she did Gone Girl. She recorded Educated by Tara Westover. I actually looked on her page on Audible. I think she has like 25 pages of books.
Oh my God.
That she's recorded. And she also records for Autumn, which is owned by the New York Times. And she just has this amazing ability to embody characters of all ages, men, women, children. And I'm hearing her voice as I'm reading. And I just want to read you an interesting paragraph about the prep work that an audiobook narrator does before they start recording. Then she began prepping a book she was recording in a few weeks, making word lists and finding the correct pronunciations, identifying the emotional arc of the story, marking breath points in syntactically challenging passages, mapping relationships between the characters, and developing voices and accents. Book prep had become as relevant to her as rehearsal had once been for performing a play or researching a character before shooting a film. But Swanee Chester hadn't stepped on a stage or in front of a camera for 7 years. I never really thought of what went into creating the voices and getting to know the characters if you're not the author of the book, but you have to get to know the material as intimately as the author of the book. And so I'm excited. I've only read about a chapter, I think, of Thank You for Listening. But as a longtime Julia Whalen stan, is that the right way to put it, MJ? I don't even know.
That's the way to put it.
Okay, I try. I mean, I know my sister's going to listen to this and make fun of me, but whatever, I said it. I am a Julia Whalen stan. It's a pleasure to find her between the covers of a book, not just in my ears.
And when the audiobook does come out, you can come back and tell us whether she reads it and how she does.
Absolutely. That would be my pleasure.
I'm going to talk about something quite old. You're both reading very recent stuff. And in fact, and Liz, you're taking us into the future, Liz. So we're
Yes.
time traveling a bit. I'm going to talk about a book that I talked about earlier this year, partly as a way into one wrinkle of being a reader and how it can be to return to something and go slowly through a book. I'm finishing finally this novel called A Word Child by Iris Murdoch, which came out in the mid 70s. It was one of, I think it was like her 17th or 18th novel. Once she started writing, she was very prolific and it's fantastic. It's about, I don't think I got much into the plot last time because I was very early on, but it's about a guy named Hilary Bird, who is the first person narrator of this book, who lives a kind of crummy life in London. He spends a lot of time with his sister, who is unmarried and has him over to dinner once a week, and they have a very close relationship. He doesn't really want to settle down either. And you learn that a long time ago, there was a tragic accident he was involved with, and that it derailed his life and made him feel very guilty. And now in the current day, someone involved with that accident, someone whose life was also influenced by it, reappears, and it throws Hilary into this spiral of, do I get away from this person? Do we confront each other? Can there be atonement, redemption? Is he going to kill me? All these sort of intense philosophical questions. But like with Murdoch, and this is the larger point I wanted to make, the plot is, she's a fantastic writer. She's a very philosophical writer. She's a philosopher as well as a fiction writer. But the plot is so strong and the characters so vividly drawn that it's one of the very few books in the last, I don't know, my whole reading life really, that I'm able to put down and be away from for even up to like a month. And when I pick it back up, I don't feel at all lost or confused about what had happened in the past in the book. I know exactly where it is, exactly where I left off, and I'm just right back on the rails. And that to me is so rare that it almost makes me want to read it again to figure out just how strenuously you have to plot something or develop people and their relationships to each other to make that happen. Because it doesn't say anything good about my brain, but I normally am I have to go back and skim what came before to reorient myself and get a sense of things. I mean, do either of you feel that way, or are you just locked in?
No, to me, it's a gift when you can dip in and dip out and pick up a book that maybe you put down a few weeks ago and continue it the way that you would a movie you walked away from. I love doing that.
Same. And I'm wondering, John, what is it about the quality of the writing here that allows you to do that? You mentioned that some books you can do it and some books you can't. Is it how the plot is paced? Is it how the relationships are rendered? What is it about this?
That's sort of the question that is bugging me because I'm so curious about it. But I think partly it's that Murdoch, she sometimes got dinged by critics, I think unfairly, for her plots being a little schematic, in the sense that she sets up these quagmires of sorts philosophically that you're then asked to, consider really big ideas about, free will or about guilt or about interpersonal relationships. And so I do think she's probably, in a way that seems fairly subtle while you're reading it, because she's such a good writer, I think she is setting up these big blocks of personalities and issues, and the way that people relate to each other in these books can be very dramatic. Like, for instance, the accident that this guy was part of, it's very difficult to forget the fact that this guy has re-entered his life and what role he plays, because it's just capital D dramatic. And so, you'd have to probably be years away from the book to forget what the central issue in it is. And so I think that's part of it. It's just that she was very interested in making things vivid thought experiments in a way, which makes the fiction sound very abstracted and philosophical. But I think the other part of it is that she's fantastic at making people come to life on the page, the way they look, the way they act around people. And so you have that combination maybe of the vivid details of the world, the physical details of the world, with these larger philosophical movements. And maybe it's that combination that allows you to keep each of them in your mind maybe longer than you would with the average book if things are a bit flatter or less, feel like the stakes are less high. I think we've solved it.
Speaking of people coming alive on the page, and speaking of Iris Murdoch, I have to ask if you've read Elegy for Iris by John Bailey.
I have not. I have not. I think
Oh,
I
my
have it around
goodness.
here somewhere. Yes, I am going to read more about her because I've read several of her novels in the last year or two, and I'm on a kick. So I also have Peter Conrady's biography. I think it's called Iris, A Life.
You have to read Elegy for Iris for anyone who doesn't know. It's a memoir that came out in 1999, and it's by John Bailey, who was Iris Murdoch's husband. And it's a memoir about their life together, which is just has all the wonderful literary hallmarks that we all love reading about. But it's also about her death from Alzheimer's. And it's this incredibly sensitive portrait of caretaking and loyalty through some pretty unimaginable stuff.
Okay, well,
It's
as you
so
list, the
good.
last thing I need is another book to read, but I'm adding it to the pile. I appreciate it. And
If you're becoming an Iris Murdoch completist, which I am not, I can't even pretend to be a fraction of a completist, but that book was one of those books that kind of introduced me to the whole genre of memoirs. It was a different era where I don't know, I feel like there must have been a lot of memoirs coming out, but it was the tip of the memoir iceberg, if you will. And oh my goodness, it will stop you in your tracks.
okay, I'm going to read
wonderful.
it. And in the few minutes I have between this segment and the next one, I'm going to listen to a Harry Styles song. So let's list again the books we've been reading.
I am reading Everything I Need I Get From You, How Fangirls Created the Internet as We Know It by Caitlin Tiffany.
I am reading Thank You for Listening by Julia Whalen. And John, if you would like me to send you my pictures from the Harry Styles concert I went to in September, they are available upon request.
Please do. And I am finally finishing A Word Child by Iris Murdoch. Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books. And you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. The Book Review Podcast is produced by the great Pedro Rosado from Headstepper Media. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm John Williams.